The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. So now we're transitioning into carbon regulation. What is carbon regulation, and can you provide an example?
Okay, carbon regulation. This is where you decide that the easiest way to do something is say, thou shalt not, or thou shalt. And a good example of that at one level would be building codes.
Yes,
And
and that's a great example too.
Yeah, so we are increasingly seeing building codes structured so that new buildings will eventually become net zero. If you think about it, that's a really good way to work. The danger with that is, I don't know if the figure's true for North America, but in the UK, we renew our building stock at around 1% a year.
It's the same number around here, John.
Yeah. So what you then have to do is you then have to pass that regulation on to refurbishment as well as new build. I think one of the best examples of regulation that works in both our jurisdictions has been seatbelts in cars. That was a very simple regulation to put out. People understood it, and here's the thing, they related to it because the majority of people thought, oh, this could protect me, this could save my life. So they got some buy-in to it. When you start doing various forms of carbon regulation, not everybody sees where the benefit is. Now, if we go back to the building stock, and if we think residential, as a buyer or a renter of a residential property, you're going to go, this regulation's great because I am going to spend less on heating or cooling my home. For the builder, they've suddenly got the issue, they may have to spend more. Now, we have to be careful here. Very often the argument used against low energy housing and low energy buildings is, oh, they cost far more to build. It's not necessarily true. They won't be cheaper, but they're not necessarily massively more expensive.
Yeah, that's a really important point because you hear that common, like, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money. And the work that we've done with a college, they actually found when they made the improvements in the building, actually it reduced not only the cost of building, the operating cost, it made the building much more suitable for the people that would use the building. So there's a lot of positive side, but you're right, John, you hear this frequently, and that tends to be from people that don't want to change because what they have is currently working for them, or they're selling something that is going to be impacted, so they'll throw that out.
But you will push back on regulation. We've got reasonably good building regs in the UK, not as good as, say, Scandinavia, but then they have a slightly different climate to deal with, so they deal with it in a different way. But if you take what's going on here, we are saying, and I believe New York is also saying, that after a certain date, no gas-fired heating in buildings. So where I am, I have a gas-fired heating system, and I don't want to open up a whole can of worms here, but I buy it through a utility company that offsets the gas. I buy renewable electricity and they offset the gas. So I pay slightly more for my gas than I would if it's non-offset. But what they would now say to me is, going forward, I have to get rid of my gas boiler furnace and I have to replace that with the most logical option would be an air source heat pump.
Yeah.
Now, at the moment, having replaced my boiler, 2-3 years ago, it is right that at times people do push back on this, but I can see where it will come under regulation. There's going to be the point in the life of my house where the boiler needs replacing and the regulations will go, you can't replace it with a gas boiler. You then have to go over. So, regulation can work well if people understand it. It's interesting, even if they don't like it, it's still there and in place. But that comes back to the political issue. Can the government of the day get it through the government process of approval to regulate?
And I think this could be said even for carbon tax, but I think the issue that a lot of people have is they learn how to work in that regulated market. That takes time. There's a cost incurred by learning that. And then also with the government's whim, they change it. So we had a cap and trade program here in Ontario. Yeah. Quite a bit of time and effort was put in place by organizations to participate in that. there was a change in government and they just wiped it out. And actually, some customers were negatively impacted because they had bought some carbon credits to mitigate, and I think it became whole, but after a while, but they were impacted. So I think a lot of companies are fearful. First of all, if it may not be good regulation. Two, they're fearful they're going to learn it and then it's going to change. And that becomes an issue. And because it's an issue, most customers won't do it or do it well because they're fearful that they invest all this money and then they're holding the bag after it. So that's, I think,
I think that's an interesting view. If you like, we talk about volatility in energy prices. There can be volatility in policy. And again, a sort of more domestic example here, our government, when it was pursuing climate change more strongly than it is today, it decided to incentivize you to have a diesel engined car. And if you look at that, I mean, in simple terms, you are doubling the miles per gallon or kilometers per litre, or whichever way you want to look at it, that you're going to get. And a lot of people bought in, and how they did this was that they lowered the taxation on diesel. That combined with the fact that it had higher MPG meant you got lower cost motoring. So lots of people switched, and in fact most company car fleets switched over to diesel. We then had the focus changed not on the carbon emissions, but all the other pollutants. And it will not have escaped you in North America, the issues with the Volkswagen Group and their sort of misreporting of emissions. So we now suddenly go, oh, there's lots of particulate matters and other things coming out of the diesel engine. If these are in a city like Toronto, London, Birmingham, Washington, these are adding to the local air pollution, which is a bad thing and is an immediate problem. So we, not overnight, but very shortly, we went from incentivizing a diesel car to disincentivizing it.
Right.
And that becomes quite interesting. So you now get, when the government says, oh, we now want you to go to electric cars, you can see how people might be going, yes, and are they going to find something wrong with that and change it? So it's odd. We want businesses to make long-term decisions. Market forces don't tend to help with long-term decisions. You'd like to think that regulation and other things do. But if you, as you say, if you have the battles over cap and trade systems and other things that are occurring, particularly where you've got a federal type of government or, provinces and federal, and states and things like that, it's going to make people go, you want me to do something like a cogen plant that's going to have a 5 or 10 year payback, and yet I don't know how the landscape that you're putting out in tax regulation and other things is going to support that. So that creates an interesting dynamic.
So think about this. Let's just use what we started with, that we wanted to achieve a 50% reduction by 2030. I'm saying in general.
Yeah.
Trying to come up with the best and most effective way, whether it's regulation or a tax, it's not a straightforward answer, but it has to happen quickly because the marketplace needs to react quickly. And not just because we say it has to react. As you said, John, I mean, all you have to do is look at insurance claims now that companies are being hit with, or even your homes, like insurance has gone up dramatically. So we're getting impacted. And I don't know if there's a real clear answer, if it should be regulation or carbon tax. Maybe, like you said, it's got to be a combination of both.
I think the actual solution to climate change is going to be a blended response.
Yeah.
But there is one key factor with that blended response that is most important, and that is what I'm going to refer to as either culture or behavior change.
Yes, and I think the objective of the legislation and the carbon tax should be, it doesn't matter who's in government, it should be the same objective that they have laid out for, and that's to reduce, right? So
yeah, because I've always had this view. Years back, I did a piece of work for the government here on the application of management techniques in energy efficiency. That was the study, because there was a massive focus on, it's all about the technology. And without going through the entire report, one of the conclusions that I drew and put into that report is if you haven't got people that are prepared to change the way they operate and look at things, then they're not going to invest in the technology. They're not going to look at it. They're not going to embrace it. So all of this comes down to behaviour change, and at the front end of behaviour change becomes education.
Literacy. Yep.
Yeah.
The easy, simple way that I try to make carbon tax and carbon regulation make sense for me, it's obviously not correct in all scenarios, but I kind of look at carbon tax as like a per unit basis. Like, for instance, if you're buying a liter of something, you're paying a carbon tax on the liter. And then I look at carbon regulation as sort of like a capital cost. Because I think a lot of times when we're talking carbon regulation, it's making a change of your equipment. So you're buying something to fully replace your diesel with an electric or things like that. So I know it's not always accurate, but that's kind of how I try to simplify it to myself when I'm looking at the difference between the two.
It's actually, that's a really good analogy, Lysandra, where they blend is you actually look at life cycle costs. So not only do you look at the capital cost, but you got to look at the operating cost. So like, so they should be considered and understood by society as they go forward, for sure.
Now, whilst we're talking about that, and we've thrown the education piece in, one of the things you're talking about, the complications that exist, there is a major complication with regulation, and that is those being regulated being aware of it. And you might think, oh, well, that's not too difficult. Keeping up to date with what's happening in regulation and legislation, I think the same would probably apply in most jurisdictions. Legislation is a law that goes through government and it puts something in place. So, there's a legislation for robbery. You know where you stand. Regulation tends to be instruments that are underneath legislation, and the Secretary of State or somebody else can tweak and play with those without necessarily going through the full governmental process. So keeping aware of what's going on could be difficult. Here, and I would think in Canada and the US, you can subscribe to services that will keep you updated on the laws and regulations as they affect your particular industry. Now, some people do that, some people don't. We've got a regulation here that requires, in simple terms, energy audits of large corporations every 4 years. I have recently dealt with 3 companies who, if I told you their names, you would know them. So we're not talking small companies, who all failed to understand that they needed to do something under the regulation. Can you blame that on government? Well, government's view is ignorance of the law is no excuse. You operating in business need to make yourself aware. So I think one of the problems with regulation can be people understanding it and knowing it exists.
Agree. And that probably, John, that's to be said probably for all regulations, but I'm particularly mindful that it's probably even more evident as it relates to energy and carbon, because at least in North America, it's not seen as an important or a controllable cost. So they kind of dismiss it. And I think that's, in my view, why perhaps some people are not as knowledgeable. You can take advantage of regulation if you actually know how to work with it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think the other thing that was interesting with it's known as ESOS in this country, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. Sounds as like it's an incentive program. It's actually a set of regulations, and it requires these audits. But government didn't know who to notify in particular companies, because that's one of the things it did, as well as publishing it. So in a lot of cases, it issued to a role that we call the company secretary. So this is the legal officer of the company. And what we found is in a lot of cases, this came in, went across the desk of this person. They didn't understand what it was, didn't pass it on to somebody else, dismissed it. And so, the regulation did not work for them.
It almost sounds like a utility bill, John.
Yeah. But it's where I come back to it. The seatbelt law, we had major television campaigns. We had everything going on. We had a slogan, clunk, click, every trip. You know, it's the sound of putting on your seatbelt. And we had all sorts of things going on like that. But when you talk about energy regulation and things like that, I mean, here you talk about building regulations, and most people don't think of it as something positive. It's, oh God, I want to do something. I've got to get approval from building regulations. They might, and we find this as well, you can buy a property, residential or commercial, send in a surveyor for your due diligence and discover things have been done to it that are not in line with the regulation. Because who is there enforcing the regulation?
Right.
If they don't know that you've made a change to your building, you don't tell them, then it doesn't have to meet the regulations.
Right.
John, when was that seatbelt law? Because I've worn a seatbelt my whole life.
It was before you were born.
And by the way, we're reminded every time we take a flight how to hook up a seatbelt. So
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting, and you make a really good point there, and we should never forget about different age groups looking at things. If we said to you, drive down the road at speed without a seatbelt on, I reckon you'd feel really uncomfortable.
My car would beep, beep, beep until I put it on, too.
Yeah, that's true. But, you know, I grew up in a thing where people would not think anything of breaking the law and breaking the speed limit of 70 miles per hour and not wearing a seatbelt.
yeah, it's true. Nowadays, you would feel insecure if you didn't have your seatbelt on.
And this is the whole thing. And I know it's a simplistic example, but we managed to get the message across to people that it could save their life. You've only got to talk to emergency room surgeons and staff. And, you know, they used to regularly see people who'd gone through windscreens on cars or had other damage, or the steering wheel was in their chest.
Right.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'll just take the thing a bit further. You're quite happy to put your car in for regular maintenance and servicing because, well, it will drive better, it will be safer. Do you do the same with your buildings?
Yeah.
Would you
How often do you recommission your building? Yes.
Yeah. You know, whereas you think with your car, well, yeah, it's my car. And I think this comes around to ownership of a problem. And I think one of the things we know for sure in most things, if somebody doesn't feel ownership of a problem, very few people then feel responsibility to do something about that problem.
John, I think you nailed a point I've been thinking about. I think a big carbon regulation challenge is a lot of people, for instance, maybe some of our listeners who are owners of organizations, feel like the blame is shifted onto them for the carbon problem. So, for instance, if we're talking a manufacturer, people want cars, but why is a manufacturer taking the full blame for that? So I think, for instance, they can feel that blame. Or if we're talking a greenhouse, we all consume vegetables and fruits, right? Are they to pay the carbon tax, or are we to pay it on the end produce product? And I know it's a matter of these manufacturers, these greenhouses, changing their process to be more carbon friendly. But to do that, again, is things like new equipment or things like changing their practices, which may cost more money, may save money. It's a mixture of both. So I think there is a lot of issues with carbon regulation in the sense that it's not a simple law. It's written as a simple law, but to execute it, it's not as simple as it seems.
We have a major issue, I believe, in this country, and I'll go on record saying this, in the quality of our legal draftsmanship. And I know this from legislation that I've been involved in part of the consultation process. And that makes me sound really important. No, it's a public consultation making responses to it. And you go through it and you find that the idea can be good. I mean, a good example of it is, I don't know about Canada, but knife crime is an issue in this country. You know, there is more knife crime than we like. So everybody talks about, well, we should ban knives. But at which point we don't ban knives, we ban people from carrying knives. Okay, so which knives do you ban them from carrying? I mean, I grew up as a Boy Scout and I used to carry a penknife. When I was a kid, every boy, not girls, I mean, things were different then. Every boy had a penknife. Today, every child should have a penknife. But no, we wouldn't do that for a variety of reasons. And then, oh, what about the chef going to work, carrying a roll of knives with them? So how do you actually control this? Do you decide that knives of a certain size are a problem? And I think that is a big, big problem. We've got a problem with educating people about understanding carbon. Let's rewind. We've got a problem with them even understanding energy that the carbon comes from.
And I think we have addressed this in past podcasts. I think certainly in North America, the expertise in the government as far as knowledge base on how energy or carbon is in society, their lack of knowledge or experience in dealing with it challenges them in writing this type of documentation as well, John. So.
Yeah, I think as well, a problem that you have more of than we have, and I'm not saying we don't have it, but you have more of a problem from the power lobby group. And when I mean power, I mean the powerful lobbyers.
Right.
It's interesting because we're making a lot of these parallels with crime because we're talking government and law, and typically if you break a law, it's a crime. And I'm going to be very curious when these climate change disasters happen in cities, who is going to take that sort of blame for those things? Who's going to be paying for it? Who is legally responsible for it? I think it's going to be a big gray area because again, it's all about shifting the blame when we talk about carbon.
I think you're right. I think one of the things you're going to see there is, have you ever looked in detail at an insurance policy?
And they're so long.
Yeah, but see what it is in there that they exclude. For example, I think this could be good. One of the things that's very often excluded from an insurance policy is what they call an act of God.
Right.
In some certain types of natural disaster are excluded. So, for example, the area that I live in, we have been prone to flooding, not where I am, but the general area. So consequently, some insurers, if you've got a postcode, zip code of a certain type, they will not provide you cover for flooding. So we could have the thing that we will notice that maybe insurers will start to put exclusion clauses in for certain kinds of disaster. Should they cover you for a natural disaster or not? There's going to be that. So when that happens, then people will then look to government to put things right. Because you imagine, I don't know, what do you think would be the most likely climate disaster that could hit Toronto?
Flooding.
Right.
Yes, because you have had problem with basements, haven't you, in the past, flooding?
Yeah.
So imagine that you get not a tsunami, but a major flood of Toronto. Could the provincial and federal government allow that situation to exist if insurers and other people weren't prepared to put it right? The answer is everybody would expect the government to step in.
And John, we have had that in Toronto. So we've had some significant flooding that's actually occurred. I did want to bring up an issue that I think, Sandra, your question about who's responsible. I think executives are starting to be worried that they could be held accountable if their organizations aren't taking appropriate action. So executives or the company itself. So there's some lawsuits that are going on against some even energy organizations that deem that they knew what they were doing all along. And so I do believe that's a concern to executives realizing that they could be on the hook if they don't take appropriate due diligence. So I think that's a factor that's starting to play out as well.
Dave, I want to clarify. Sorry. When you mean that they were responsible all along, you mean for their emissions, like their previous emissions or their energy usage?
Yeah. So thank you for that.
Okay.
If there's a catastrophic event that had they taken action on energy / carbon emissions. So let's just use the oil companies, for example, because that's the easiest one to hit. There's a thought that they knew that their product was a major contributor to climate change. And because they're a major contributor to climate change, and they knew about it, and they didn't take steps, and the world is facing significant cost increases, that they are going to be held accountable for some of those costs. And so they or their companies will be held accountable or sued or charged for that. And so that's where this is going. And I mean, that's a pretty obvious example, but you can now even hear cities realizing for floods, if they don't take appropriate action, they're fearful that their constituents will sue them because they didn't have the proper infrastructure in play as well.
I was going to say, I think you touched on something there when you were talking about the energy companies, and there are people who work in this field who are likening oil companies and emissions to big tobacco and
Yes.
the issues that were there. I think that's one thing on the radar. Another thing on the radar, and you might say, oh, it's not related, but it's about responsibility. We had a major building and construction firm that collapsed in this country. And part of the reason it collapsed is, and this is a matter of public record, so I'm not going to get in trouble saying this, their auditors were KPMG, and KPMG filed some erroneous documents. And what we're seeing now is action is being taken against KPMG and 6 individuals working for KPMG. So not just the corporate liability aspect, but individuals are facing action as well. And we could, in the future, there is a world where action could be taken against executives because they were aware of some of these issues and failed to act accordingly. I think it's a little far-fetched, but on some of the lower level things, it may happen. We've had the thing with change with corporate manslaughter. I don't know if that's where, let's say somebody gets killed in your workplace because of a health and safety issue. So that could be a case of corporate manslaughter. Traditionally, that would be an act against the company.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they're looking at there is going, well, hold on, can't we hold individuals responsible as well? So you don't get the protection necessarily of the corporate. So yes, this all gets really interesting, doesn't it, as to the potentials of what could or could not happen.
And I'm actually, I believe that is in executives' minds now. I mean, yes, their clients are demanding it or requesting it. That's for sure got to be a driver. There's also, they recognize they want to do something for their families in the future. But I don't doubt they think there could be some legalities as well if they don't take appropriate action going forward, somehow impact. And from my experience, executives are very risk management oriented. That's part of their function of their job. So
Yeah.
I think that's now entering into their consideration in this whole thing.
Well, here you go. This time it's personal. We were talking about problems don't get solved unless, they feel personal. You're talking about regulation. I was involved with a university here, and we were running a program for small businesses, and we were trying to get people to come along, and it was about environmental regulation, and we put up nice names for it. Didn't get much uptake. We changed it to directors in the dock. So, the doc being in court and directors being the individual. And suddenly we got a whole load of people signed up.
Right.
Because they hadn't seen that there was a possibility that they, as a director of the company, might end up in court for something their company did. So that changes the focus.
And I'll just add, I think boards are now feeling that and are now moving it towards the executive. But I think that's it.
Now, we touched on this throughout the conversation, but just getting a more blunt, direct answer. How does government affect carbon tax and carbon regulation?
Oh, if there was no government, there wouldn't be the tax or regulation. So they have a total choice of how they do it and whether they do it well or not. Yes, it's going to be impacted, I think, I certainly touched on it earlier, by the political flavour of the government and the pressures that they're feeling. I think Dave touched on it. I think one of the issues is, always dangerous saying is, does the government have the competence to deal with the issue properly? We like to think they do because government refers to its civil service, who refer to its appropriate experts. But often we have seen the case where the experts say one thing, and we may have seen this in all our jurisdictions with COVID, where the experts have said one thing and government's gone, well, actually, we won't do that exactly. So, yeah. I don't think there's a simple. You like simple questions and you like simple answers. I don't think there's a simple answer to that one.
They don't exist in the 360 of energy and carbon.
No, they don't seem to. I also suggest that I think if politicians really had a long term and they didn't worry about them being elected in the next 3 years, I think they would think differently. But I mean, that's the world we live in. It's the same thing could be said about an executive, because the shelf life of an executive may not, maybe 3 to 5 years, maybe the same thing. But if there was a longer term view, and then they were held accountable even when they left the organization, that would change everything, right? That would change everything. But the way society is set up, that's not the case right now. So,
well, I think to add something to that, no names, as they say, but I do remember us talking to a client about 2050 and 2030, and I think his response was, well, I hope to be retired by 2030. And the subtext to that is, I'm not going to be answerable in 2030.
So the only way you change that is someone feels personally passionate about that. It's a really important thing for society.
Well, these are
But
the companies that are making change, aren't they? Where there are individuals or boards that feel passionate and want to change the way they're doing business. And equally, we're seeing it with startups where there are founders wanting to start up a new business that does business in a different way.
yeah, I'm actually hopeful that the customers that we deal feel we do the same. That's our philosophy. Because sometimes I know they don't like hearing what we're recommending because it doesn't serve them personally well in the short term, but we're trying to do something that benefits them in the long term. So,
Yeah.
I think that's my frustration, I would say, with government in general. I think this shifting blame is just it's happened too long and we're already seeing those repercussions. And I think what kind of keeps my generation more in the loop on the effects of climate change is if you go to social media, you can see videos of people first person from those climate change floods or from those climate change disasters, and they're pretty horrifying. And I think because we see it kind of feels like we're living it. And I think that's what kind of changes our perspective and makes it more serious.
Yeah.
valid
Come
point.
back to the thing. You've got to be bought in some way.
Yeah.
Nobody will change. What was it? One of the things in personal improvement, you won't change your behavior unless you're unhappy with it or the results that it's getting.
So I want to go on a limb here, Alessandra. I don't know where we are as far as time wise, but I am convinced and do believe that by 2030, the way of thinking will be so much different from what it is now.
Yeah.
Like completely different. I mean, as far as the norms of how people think about carbon emissions. And the only way that's going to happen, it's going to be society being involved, and that will be a combination of regulation and some type of pricing signal. If you don't do it, you're going to be in your costs are going to increase significantly in some fashion that might be uncontrollable. So I do believe it is going to happen, and we just need to try to make it happen as quickly as possible.
Yes. Yeah.
Agreed. Now, we've kind of said carbon tax and carbon regulation is mostly, I mean, it is set by the government and controlled by the government, but is there anything a business or organization can do about carbon tax and carbon regulation?
Yes, I'll take a stab at this, John, because I think we've both been involved in different countries doing.
Yeah.
So we will actually work with our clientele to actually provide input in direction to the government of how they're going to facilitate that. Because frequently, and this doesn't matter, it doesn't matter where you live, is there's some loud speakers that typically get what they want. They tend to be larger organizations. Typically, the smaller ones don't have the time or the resource. So it's really important that what John was saying earlier, if you understand pending regulation or what's coming down as far as pricing, that you understand that and you give direction to the government, give input to the government. And I encourage to do that early. So do not think you can't be involved to make a change, because that way of thinking, you've got to be involved in this whole process. So speak up and speak up early. I think that would be my point of view. John, I know you have experience in this as well.
I would agree. I'd add to that, one of the things that works here is if you're part of a trade association, they will try to, how can we put it, get the best outcome. But I think, if we're talking just takeaways almost, you need to be aware of what's going on in the field of energy and carbon regulation and taxation. And if it's something you can't do yourself, you need to have somebody doing it for you, a service provider or somebody that's helping. And then the other thing is, given everything we've talked about, if you pursue effective energy efficiency and energy management, your chances are you're going to mitigate much of the impact of carbon taxing and regulation.
And the message that should be pretty consistent with what John said, Lysandra, the earlier you do it, the better, the lower your costs will be. I know sometimes that might be in deaf ears because most people don't understand the impact of that, but we've experienced with customers where it's not only a lower cost, creates a lower cost operating cost for them, but actually puts them in a better position of serving new clients and long-term clients to do it too. So
I think on my end, what I kind of see is a lot of businesses and organizations see carbon tax and see carbon regulation and just get frustrated. And I think it's understandable to be frustrated, but I think to take the time and actually research yourself as to why these carbon taxes and carbon regulations are put in place is very important for you to understand how to better your business and organization with these carbon taxes and regulations. So, for instance, listen to a podcast, research on Google. There's plenty of articles out there. Talk to maybe a local lawmaker or someone, a consultant that can help you out. There's so many different avenues to take, and I think it's all about, reducing that frustration and increasing that education.
And as I said much earlier, if you do it and you do it efficiently, you can actually benefit your organization versus it being a cost burden to you.
Yeah, there are two inevitabilities in life, death and taxation. And then somebody modified that to say the inevitabilities in life are death, taxation, and change.
Yes.
Okay, well, a great episode, Dave and John. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Oh, it was great having the discussion, Lysandra. Thank you for spearheading this as always.
Yes, I just hope our ramblings make some sense to the people who listen to us. But I think if nothing else, people can tell that I hope they can tell we're both knowledgeable and passionate about the subject. And if we shared something, then fantastic.
I think the passion is clear. The passion is very clear.
Yeah.
All right. Talk to you next week.
Okay. Thanks,
Looking forward to it. Bye.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.